The summer of 1947 burned hot across the New Mexico desert. In the small ranching community near Roswell, where the horizon stretched endlessly under an unforgiving sun, William Mack Brazel had seen his share of strange things scattered across the arid landscape. Tumbleweeds, weather balloons, the occasional piece of military debris from the nearby Army airfield. Nothing that particularly troubled a man who'd spent decades working the harsh terrain. But what he discovered that July morning would transform his quiet life into the epicenter of one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. Brazel had been checking his sheep after a severe thunderstorm the night before, when he noticed something unusual glinting in the morning light. As he approached, his boots crunching on the dry earth, he stopped short. Scattered across a 3/4-mile debris field were pieces unlike anything he'd encountered. The material was lightweight yet incredibly strong, with strange metallic properties that defied explanation. Some pieces bore unusual markings, symbols he couldn't decipher. There were thin beams, incredibly light but impossibly rigid, and sheets of a silvery substance that wouldn't burn and seemed to remember its original shape when crumpled. Unsure what to make of his discovery, Brazel collected some samples and, after a few days of deliberation, drove into Roswell to report his find to Sheriff George Wilcox. The sheriff, equally puzzled, contacted the Roswell Army Airfield, home to the 509th Bomb Group, the only military unit in the world at that time equipped and trained to deliver atomic weapons. This detail, seemingly innocuous, would prove crucial to understanding what followed. Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer from the base, drove out to the ranch with Brazel. What Marcel saw that day would haunt him for the rest of his life. Years later, he would describe material with properties that seemed beyond conventional technology, metal that wouldn't burn, beams lighter than balsa wood but impossible to break, and a quantity of debris that suggested something substantial had come down in that remote location. On July 8, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release that would echo through history. Lieutenant Walter Haut, the base public information officer, announced that the field's 509th Bomb Group had recovered a micro-flying disc from a ranch near Roswell. The statement was extraordinary, sensational, and, as would soon become apparent, premature. The news exploded across America. Headlines screamed about flying saucers and alien craft. For a few brief hours, the world believed that humanity had made contact with visitors from another world. Newspapers from coast to coast picked up the story. The Roswell Daily Record's afternoon edition proclaimed, "RAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region." But then something remarkable happened. Within hours, higher military authorities intervened. Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force at Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas, where some of the debris had been flown, held a press conference. The material, he announced, was nothing more exotic than a weather balloon. Photographs were taken showing Major Marcel and others posing with debris that looked decidedly mundane: torn rubber, wooden sticks, and reflective material consistent with a conventional weather device. The retraction was swift, decisive, and, to many observers, deeply suspicious. How could trained military personnel, including an intelligence officer from the nation's only atomic bomb squadron, mistake a common weather balloon for something extraordinary? The speed and certainty of the cover story, combined with reports of military personnel sweeping the area and threatening witnesses with dire consequences if they spoke about what they'd seen, suggested something more complex was at play. What the public couldn't know, what wouldn't be revealed for nearly 50 years, was that they were witnessing not a cover-up of alien contact, but rather a desperate attempt to protect one of America's most sensitive Cold War secrets. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more fascinating than tales of extraterrestrial visitors, and it spoke to the paranoia and secrecy that would define the next 4 decades of geopolitical tension. Behind the scenes, the real story of Roswell was about earthly concerns, specifically the Soviet Union's race to develop nuclear weapons and the lengths to which the United States would go to monitor their adversaries' progress. The debris that Mac Brazel found wasn't from another world. It was from another kind of frontier entirely, one where technology pushed boundaries, and where secrecy meant survival in a newly bipolar world order. The material came from Project Mogul, a classified program so sensitive that even decades later, Many of its details remain obscured. The project involved high-altitude balloon trains, arrays of weather balloons carrying sophisticated acoustic equipment designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests from hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The concept was ingenious. Sound waves from nuclear explosions would travel through the upper atmosphere, and sensitive microphones suspended at extreme altitudes could detect these reverberations, giving American intelligence vital information about Soviet capabilities. The particular balloon that crashed near Roswell had been designated Flight 4, launched from Alamogordo Army Airfield on June 4, 1947. It had drifted northwest, carried by high-altitude winds, before coming down on the Foster Ranch. The unusual materials Brazel found were consistent with the specialized equipment used in Project Mogul: radar reflectors made with balsa wood and metallic foil, tough synthetic materials for the balloon envelopes, and various instrumentation designed to survive at extreme altitudes where temperatures plunged and atmospheric pressure dropped to near vacuum levels. The timing of the Roswell incident could not have been more critical to understanding its significance in the broader context of the Cold War. In July 1947, the world was barely 2 years removed from the atomic devastations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States held a monopoly on nuclear weapons, but American intelligence knew this advantage wouldn't last forever. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin's iron rule, was pouring enormous resources into developing its own atomic bomb. And the question wasn't if they would succeed, but when. This uncertainty created an atmosphere of almost unbearable tension in Washington and military circles. The Roswell Army Airfield wasn't just any military installation. It was the tip of America's nuclear spear, housing the 509th Composite Group that had dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. The base represented both America's ultimate weapon and its deepest vulnerability. If the Soviets developed nuclear capability, the strategic calculus of global power would shift dramatically and potentially catastrophically. Project Mogul emerged from this anxiety. Conceived by Dr. Morris Ewing, a geophysicist at Columbia University, and developed by scientists at New York University, the project sought to exploit a phenomenon known as the sound channel, a layer of the atmosphere where sound waves could travel extraordinary distances with minimal loss. The theory was that nuclear explosions would create acoustic signatures detectable by sensitive equipment positioned in this channel, roughly 40,000 to 60,000 feet above the Earth's surface. The technology was experimental and ambitious. Each balloon train consisted of multiple weather balloons connected by nylon lines carrying payloads that included microphones, radio transmitters, and radar reflectors. These reflectors, constructed from balsa wood frames covered with a foil-like material, were designed to make the balloon trains visible to ground tracking stations. It was precisely these reflectors, lightweight, covered in strange markings from the manufacturer, and constructed from materials unfamiliar to most civilians, that contributed to the exotic appearance of the debris Brazel found. The secrecy surrounding Project Mogul wasn't merely about protecting technology, it was about concealing America's intelligence capabilities and, crucially, its vulnerabilities. If the Soviet Union knew the United States was using high-altitude balloons to monitor their nuclear program, they could take countermeasures. They might time test to coincide with weather patterns that would disrupt monitoring, or they might develop techniques to minimize the acoustic signatures of their explosions. Every piece of information about American surveillance capabilities was a potential advantage for the enemy. This explains the frantic military response to the Roswell incident. When Major Marcel initially saw the debris and the story began to leak, the military faced an impossible dilemma. They couldn't reveal the truth about Project Mogul without compromising national security, but the flying disc story had already been released and was spreading like wildfire. The weather balloon explanation, hastily constructed and poorly thought out, was meant to be mundane enough to kill public interest while avoiding any mention of classified programs. What the military hadn't anticipated was the Streisand effect avant la lettre. The more they insisted on the weather balloon story, the more suspicious people became. The heavy-handed approach, including reports of military personnel visiting witnesses and warning them to remain silent, only deepened the mystery. Rancher Brazel was reportedly held at the base for several days, and according to some accounts, emerged refusing to discuss what he'd found. Major Marcel would later tell his family that the real debris was secretly transported away, while the weather balloon materials were presented to the press as a substitution. The broader context of 1947 adds additional layers to the story. This was the year of the flying saucer craze that swept America. On June 24th, private pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 unusual objects flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state, describing their motion as similar to saucers skipping across water. The press coined the term flying saucer, and suddenly Americans were seeing them everywhere. Against this backdrop of UFO hysteria, the military's initial announcement about recovering a flying disc seemed to confirm what many already believed, that Earth was being visited by beings from other worlds. This cultural moment was itself a product of Cold War anxiety. The atomic age had shattered previous assumptions about technological limits. If humans could split the atom and unleash devastating power, what other impossibilities might become possible? The flying saucer phenomenon represented both wonder and fear. Wonder at the possibility of advanced beings and fear that those beings might pose a threat. Some psychologists and sociologists later theorized that UFO sightings served as a kind of displacement activity, channeling Cold War anxieties about Soviet threats into a more manageable, if inexplicable, form. For the military and intelligence communities, the UFO craze presented both problems and opportunities. On one hand, every reported sighting required investigation to ensure it wasn't actually a Soviet aircraft or surveillance device. On the other hand, the public's readiness to believe in flying saucers provided convenient cover for classified programs. If a civilian spotted a secret military aircraft or balloon, they might report it as a UFO, and the story would be dismissed as fantasy rather than investigated as a potential security leak. The Roswell case exemplified this dynamic perfectly. The actual secret, Project Mogul, and the intense effort to monitor Soviet nuclear development was hidden behind layers of confusion. First the flying disc announcement, then the weather balloon retraction, and finally the persistent rumor that both stories were covers for something even more extraordinary. The truth was simultaneously more prosaic than alien contact and more significant than a weather balloon mishap. It was about the deadly serious business of preventing nuclear surprise, about the lengths to which a nation would go to maintain strategic advantage, and about the culture of secrecy that would define the Cold War era. In the months and years following the incident, Project Mogul continued its work, though with modifications to prevent similar embarrassments. The project eventually concluded that detecting Soviet nuclear tests via acoustic monitoring was impractical, but by then, other methods, including atmospheric sampling from aircraft and eventually satellite reconnaissance, were providing the intelligence needed to track Soviet nuclear development. The immediate aftermath of Roswell saw the story fade from public consciousness with surprising speed. By late July 1947, the national press had moved on to other matters, accepting the weather balloon explanation or simply losing interest. For the people of Roswell, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be in a town that now harbored what many residents believed was a government secret of monumental proportions. Mac Brazel went back to ranching, though friends noted he seemed changed by the experience, reluctant to discuss what had become the most extraordinary event of his life. But the story didn't die. It merely went underground, gestating in the collective consciousness of conspiracy theorists, UFO researchers, and those who instinctively distrusted official explanations. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, as the Cold War intensified and government secrecy became more pervasive, Roswell remained a whispered legend. Major Jesse Marcel, retired from the military, would occasionally hint to family and friends that the official story wasn't complete, that what he'd seen that day in 1947 was more significant than weather balloon debris. The case exploded back into public awareness in 1978, when UFO researcher Stanton Friedman interviewed Marcel, who went on record with his doubts about the official explanation. This interview catalyzed a renewed investigation that would span decades. Books were written, documentaries produced, and witnesses came forward with accounts that had been suppressed for 30 years. Some claimed to have seen alien bodies, others described debris with impossible properties. Still others spoke of government intimidation and cover-ups that extended far beyond a simple misidentification of balloon wreckage. By the 1990s, Roswell had become a cultural phenomenon unto itself. The small New Mexico town transformed into a mecca for UFO enthusiasts, complete with alien-themed museums, gift shops, and an annual festival celebrating the incident. The town had found a way to monetize its mystery, turning what might have been a footnote in military history into a thriving tourist industry. Ironically, this commercialization occurred even as the true explanation was finally being revealed. In 1994, pressured by congressional inquiries led by New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff, the United States Air Force released a report titled The Roswell Report: Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. The document, compiled after an exhaustive search of military archives, revealed Project Mogul's existence and identified the crashed object as likely being Flight 4 from the classified balloon program. The report explained the unusual materials, the military's overreaction, and the reasons for maintaining secrecy, all connected to the imperative of monitoring Soviet nuclear capabilities during the early Cold War. A follow-up report in 1997, the Roswell Report, Case Closed, addressed the claims about alien bodies. The Air Force explained these reports as likely being confused memories of military experiments involving anthropomorphic test dummies dropped from high altitudes in the 1950s, combined with recollections of aircraft accidents where injured or deceased airmen were recovered. The report suggested that witnesses had conflated events from different time periods, creating a composite memory that matched UFO mythology rather than historical fact. For many UFO researchers and Roswell believers, these reports were simply more evidence of a cover-up, too convenient, too detailed, and released too late to be fully credible. The fact that Project Mogul was real lent credibility to the Air Force's explanation, but it also raised questions. If the government had lied for 47 years about the weather balloon, what guarantee was there that the Mogul explanation wasn't itself another layer of deception? This is the paradox that government secrecy creates. Once trust is broken, every subsequent explanation, no matter how well documented, becomes suspect. From a historical perspective, the true significance of Roswell lies not in what crashed in the desert, but in what the incident reveals about the Cold War mentality. The case demonstrates how national security concerns could override transparency, how the perceived threat of Soviet power justified extraordinary secrecy, and how the military-industrial intelligence complex operated in an environment where the ends, preventing nuclear surprise, justified virtually any means. Project Mogul itself was just one thread in a vast tapestry of Cold War surveillance and intelligence gathering. As the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, earlier than American intelligence had predicted, the inadequacy of acoustic monitoring became apparent. The United States pivoted to other methods: the U-2 spy plane program, satellite reconnaissance, electronic eavesdropping, and human intelligence operations. Each of these programs involved levels of secrecy comparable to or exceeding Project Mogul, and each generated its own constellation of mysteries, cover stories, and conspiracy theories. The culture of secrecy that Roswell exemplified would define the Cold War era and leave lasting scars on American democracy. The incident occurred just as the national security state was crystallizing. The CIA was founded in September 1947, just 2 months after the Roswell incident. The same year saw the creation of the National Security Council and the passage of the National Security Act, which restructured the military and intelligence apparatus for the long twilight struggle against communism. In this new world, secrets proliferated. Classification systems expanded exponentially. Entire programs employing thousands of people and spending billions of dollars operated in complete secrecy. The atomic weapons program, intelligence operations, military research and development, all were hidden behind walls of classification that made meaningful democratic oversight nearly impossible. Roswell became a symbol of this hidden world, a reminder that the government possessed secrets it would protect with lies, misdirection, and, when necessary, intimidation. The legacy of Roswell extends far beyond UFO mythology. It represents a founding moment in the relationship between the American public and their government during the Cold War. A relationship characterized by necessary secrecy on one side and inevitable suspicion on the other. The incident taught the public that official explanations couldn't always be trusted, that the government would lie when it deemed necessary, and that extraordinary events might have extraordinary explanations that would remain hidden for decades. Today, more than 75 years after Mac Brazel found strange debris on his ranch, Roswell remains contested ground. For some, it represents the greatest cover-up in history, proof that we are not alone in the universe, and that governments will go to extraordinary lengths to hide this truth. For others, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of government secrecy and the ease with which conspiracy theories can take root when trust is broken. And for historians of the Cold War, it's a perfect encapsulation of an era when the threat of nuclear annihilation justified almost any deception, when the line between national security and public transparency was drawn heavily in favor of secrecy, and when a crashed surveillance balloon could become the most famous alleged UFO incident in history. The case that marked the Cold War wasn't really about flying saucers at all. It was about the price of security in an age of existential threat, about the secrets nations keep, and the lies they tell, and about the lasting consequences when governments choose secrecy over truth. In the end, the real alien presence at Roswell wasn't from outer space. It was the alienation between a people and their government, a distance that the Cold War created and that in many ways has never fully been bridged.